Literacy is for all kids, not just some kids. That was one of the very profound statements by my guest today. I had the honor of speaking with Dr. Elizabeth Biggs, and we talked all about literacy and students with complex communication needs. One of the things that she brought up that makes so much sense that I never thought about is why does literacy stop? Why do we, when we go to baby showers, bring books? I always bring a book to a baby shower. There are tons of people that bring books to babies. Well, a baby isn't going to actually be reading those words themselves, but at birth is when literacy begins. And so we really kind of dig into some of these ideas. We're also talking about a paper that she co-authored in Language, Speech, and Hearing Services in Schools titled Views of Parents on Supporting Language and Literacy for Their Children with Complex Communication Needs. This is such an interesting study and such interesting information that she gathered from the study. And really, how can we use this current research going forward? What are the implications for us as treating clinicians? We break it all down today, and literacy is for all students, not just some students. If you believe that, you got to listen to this episode. It's a great one.
You're listening to Autism Outreach Podcast, a podcast full of ready-to-use strategies to help those with autism strengthen their communication skills. Here's your host, Rose Griffin of ABA Speech, a speech therapist and board-certified behavior analyst who shares tips you can use in your next therapy session.
We have a great show for you today. We have with us Dr. Elizabeth Biggs. Thanks so much for coming on the show. I'm excited to have a conversation with you today.
Hey, I'm excited to be here.
So can you tell us a little bit about you and your journey into the field and just some of the work that you've done? I was telling Elizabeth before we pressed record that she has a fascinating career. I'm always interested. I just love our field so much because it's so broad. I just taped another podcast with somebody who worked in long-term care for 20 years. Then they pivoted to working with autistic learners. That's how they found my website. And I'm just like fascinated because I used to do all the stuff until I specialized in autism. And now I do autism and help support autistic learners. But there's just so much neat work going on. So can you tell us a little bit about kind of why you became a speech language pathologist and your career and what you're up to now?
Yeah, I'd love to talk a little about myself. And I agree, people's origin stories are just a lot of fun. So I'm actually not a speech language pathologist in my training, but a special educator. And so in my current role, I am a professor of special education at Vanderbilt University. And I focus specifically on students with intellectual and developmental disabilities, particularly who have more extensive needs for support. So certainly including autistic learners in that, but especially those students who are non-speaking or who have limited use of speech for communication. But my origin was as a teacher. So I taught special education for several years in a really beautiful place on the Navajo Nation in New Mexico. So whenever I teach a class, I show this like gorgeous picture of these red rocks and I tell my students like, this was the view out of my classroom window. It was just such a beautiful place. And there are, incredible challenges about working in a low-resourced community and just really wanting to serve kids and families well. But what it did for me was just really strengthened my passion for working with students who were non-speaking or who had limited speech. And I think it was just because I had all of these kids that I realized if we could find them reliable ways to communicate, my gosh, their whole world just opens to them. And so that was really, really fun. I loved teaching and actually thought I would be in the classroom for quite a bit longer than I was, but I also really wanted more training. That was when I pursued my doctoral training, which was actually at Vanderbilt University, so where I am now. I took my first faculty position at the University of Illinois, and then I returned here to Vanderbilt in 2019. So I've been here now for a little bit in this role. I love my job. I mean, it's so much fun. I get to focus on research that I'm really passionate about, which specifically centers around supporting social communication and then language and literacy goals for students with intellectual disabilities who have limited speech. And I also get to teach and advise some really talented students who are passionate about the special education field and who go on to do great things. including Emma, who was the first author of this manuscript we'll talk about today. This was her thesis project for her master's degree. So it's really fun to get to lead innovative research and also kind of teach and advise some really incredible people.
Vanderbilt is amazing. I've had a lot of people on my podcast and doing courses for us that are from Vanderbilt. So we had Lisa Wallace on. She did one called The Power of No. And then I think somebody else who was a BCBA who talked about compassion in the field and just really cool. My brother actually lives in Mount Juliet, which is kind of in your neck of the woods. Yes, I was just out there for a soccer tournament in the fall, and I stayed at my brother's, and I live in Ohio. This is how into soccer we are. But I digress. But I love the campus, and it is like such a cool scene. If you have a chance to go to Vanderbilt or just walk the campus, do it. It's a very hip place. So I am always, I'm a treating clinician 2 days a week, and then I own ABA Speech. And so I am always trying to really stay in touch with current research, both from speech therapy and BCBA, because I'm both, because you know how it is for treating clinicians, teachers. It is really like almost impossible for people to stay in touch with what's going on. And so I came across this publication that you co-authored called From Language, Speech, and Hearing Services in the Schools. I think it's good just to talk about, because when I've been a speech therapist 20 years, and they actually used to mail us these journals. Okay. Yeah. That doesn't happen anymore, but I remember highlighting and annotating, and I still do all that stuff, but they don't mail these things out anymore. So you got to get on the website and you got to look, which is easier for me because I'm always putting together courses about current research and things like that. So I came across this article. I thought it was very interesting. So thanks for coming on. And it's called Views of Parents on Supporting Language and Literacy for Their Children with Complex Communication Needs. And that's really what we focus on here at ABA Speech, is traditionally helping students who have higher support needs or who are not yet speaking. And so I thought this article was very interesting, talking about literacy from that lens. Can you share with us and the listeners information about literacy and learners with complex communication needs, kind of just more from a baseline holistic perspective?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so I think first it's helpful just to think about what we mean by literacy. And I think so often we think about like really traditional reading and writing. And like, of course, we want all of our students to learn to be independent readers and writers. We want that for them. But literacy ultimately is about connecting with other humans. It's about this like human point of connection, and in ways that can be more permanent, right? Like that's what the writing process is. And so when we think about literacy in that way, it is so clear that it's just a part of human flourishing for everyone. And arguably, I think it's even more important for people who use augmentative and alternative communication, or AEC. And the reason for that is, think about like how print-based our language-based AEC systems are, right? To communicate using AEC, you're either dependent on what someone else programs for you in your device, or you need literacy skills. And then with those literacy skills, right, you get 26 letters and you can say anything you want to say to anybody you want to say anytime. And so it's so problematic that historically our expectations around literacy for this group of students has been really low. I think when we look historically, it's like these readiness models have really pervaded. And what I mean by that is like, oh, they're not ready to learn to read yet because they don't X, Y, or Z.
Right.
And so when we look at the history of literacy for this group of students, it's been like using sight word-based approaches, which often don't give students access to all the skills they need to be independent readers and writers. And then you like contrast all of that with what research shows that really is thinking about literacy much more from this perspective that literacy learning begins at birth. And so it's not that you suddenly become ready to learn to read and write. You're born, and so you're ready. And like, I like to think about the analogy of people who bring books to a baby shower, right? So like we always
we all do.
Baby shower, right?
I've done it. Yes, I love where you're going with this. Yes, everybody brings books to a baby shower. You bring like your favorite. I have 3 kids, so it's like you bring your favorite books. You got to have this book, right?
Yeah. And it's because we expect kids to learn to read, and we know that like they're not going to start learning to read when they're 5. They start learning when they're born. So I think applying that to our kids with complex communication needs is just really exciting. Like students will benefit from really high quality explicit instruction across all these domains of literacy. And speech language pathologists have a huge role in that in collaboration with other people like special educators and kids' families to really help make sure that we have access to really high quality literacy instruction for our students.
Yeah, I love that idea. And at one time I worked with a reading specialist. She was paid through like an educational service center here in Ohio. And she talked with us. There was a methodology. I cannot remember it now. It was almost 20 years ago, but she talked about literacy and students like we're talking about today with more complex communication needs. And I just loved it. It was simplistic ideas and these students were not yet speaking. And it was just ideas like, when you're on a field trip, take pictures and then let's make a book out of it. And then let's have a book bin and the kids can get a book for their leisure time. And there's just so many ways to access literacy. I talk about using books, all different types of books. And I just love that story about the baby shower. That's just, no one's ever said that to me before, but you're like, oh, you're born. So you're ready.
You're ready. Yeah, you're alive. You're ready.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Because it's
Yeah.
a lot about input too. And I think that's what the article
Absolutely.
was interesting is that, and we'll get into the purpose of the study, but, sometimes I feel like parents, my kids are all typical language learners, but I feel like parents I work with are just they have so much on their plate that sometimes I think they think that this isn't available to their student or it doesn't look the way they thought it would maybe look to read a book to their child. And then maybe it's not something that they pursue or feel comfortable doing. I'm just, so tell us a little bit about what the purpose of the study was.
Yeah. So this study came as a part of a larger project that was focused on the experiences of families with children with complex communication needs during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so there's this wonderful organization called the Spencer Foundation that funds a lot of educational research. They funded this work. To be really transparent, they had these really cool calls that came out during the COVID-19 pandemic where they like pop up and they're like, these grants are due in 3 weeks. Like, that's not how the grant process works, by the way. It's like these grants are due in months. So I wrote this grant and when it was funded, was just really, really excited to get to follow these families across the pandemic. So when we planned the study, it was like May of 2020. So literally, like we had no idea what was going to happen, right? We're like, okay, kids are being impacted. We want to understand how kids are being impacted. We want to understand what this is like for families. But truly, I don't think I realized, even though I planned it as this longitudinal study over the 2020 to 2021 school year, I had no idea that like we would be navigating it for that long. So our kind of primary goal was to understand broadly the experiences of these families who had elementary age kids with intellectual and developmental disabilities who were either non-speaking or who had limited speech. But then a secondary goal was we were really particularly interested in their views and experiences with supporting their children's language and literacy learning. And so we took this longitudinal approach. We followed these families across that school year, interacting with them at 3 key points. So the beginning of the school year, the middle of the school year, and the end of the school year. The data from this project are so much fun. I mean, we had all of these really rich interviews with families where we talked with them at those 3 points. They completed some questionnaires and then we even did observations through Zoom. So we've gotten to watch parents interacting with their children around play activities and literacy activities. And so this, specific study that you mentioned was really like led and taken on by Emma, this really incredible graduate student I've gotten to work with. And so it allowed us to kind of dig deeper into families' interviews, specifically around how they were viewing and experiencing what it was like to support their kids' language and literacy learning at home during this period.
Wow. And I'm sure that really varied because I know here in Ohio, the district, I was a school-based SLP 3 days a week, and we went through so many different changes of like at one point it was like everybody was virtual. And then it was like the kids who had autism or were in certain classrooms were coming in, but everybody else was virtual. So it was like, but every district was kind of doing their own thing. And my poor husband, I say poor husband because, he's in medical device sales. So I was on Zoom all day and he was trying to parent and go through the schooling process. And I just know all parents are really kind of struggling during that time. So you talk about kind of like the interviews. Were there set questions that you asked at each of these points? And if there were, could you share some of those questions that you were asking the parents, or just kind of the general ideas that you were trying to gather information about?
Yeah, definitely. So we did interviews at each of those 3 points. They ranged a lot. Some of them were kind of shorter, around 30 minutes. Some were longer, around 90 minutes. Part of that was like what we planned to do at that time point. But also parents just ranged in how much they talked. I think for a lot of parents, it was really powerful to get to share their stories with us. And it was really humbling for us to get to listen.
Yeah.
So it was neat to hear those. We kind of structured the questions based on those time points. So we asked different questions at the beginning than we did at the middle and the end. And there was a good number of families. There were 40 families approximately who participated. And so we assigned a researcher, either myself or one of the students that I get to work with, to stay with the family across the school year so they could really build up that rapport and kind of check in about things. So beginning of the year questions were things like, what has your life been like since the pandemic? And what is especially communication like for you and your child at home? How do you think your child's been impacted by service changes with the pandemic? Kind of just in general, like, how are you feeling about this school year, right? You're about to start this really weird school year. Are you
Yeah.
optimistic? Are you worried? And then we asked a lot of questions too at the beginning of the year, what their goals were for their child. So we were intrigued about how they talked about literacy, but didn't want to call it out quite yet. So just kind of hearing like, how do you talk about your goals for your child? And how do you see your role in your child's learning? Like, where do you fit? Do you see yourself as being primarily responsible, or the school, et cetera? And then we used the middle of the year time point to ask a lot more questions, really specifically about kids' educational services and how parents viewed those, particularly around literacy. So we asked things like, what is it like for you to communicate with your child's teachers and service providers? How confident do you feel that your child's teachers and service providers are meeting your kids' needs, including around language and literacy? And we asked, like, what are you doing in your home around those things? And then at the end of the year, we kind of asked them to like reflect back. So since the school year started, what's changed about your goals for your child, or what's changed about how you see your role? What's changed about how confident you feel to support your child's learning? And then we asked directed questions too, like, what do you wish teachers or service providers or schools knew to help, kids and families thrive, especially like your family?
Oh, I love that. I love having parents on the podcast too, because I'm a school-based clinician 2 days a week. You can never really ask the questions you want to be able to ask to the parents that you're actually working with. Cause like maybe you're not allowed, you're not supposed to go there. There's a boundary. You're like, what do you think of the speech services, or what so I'm sure, but when I have people on the podcast, they have a lot to share.
Oh,
So
yeah.
I'm sure those conversations, could get lengthy. And I think that's what's nice for parents. Like I do some parent coaching and things like that. And I think parents, they really just need a sounding board is what I have seen. It's like they might have great services and may be completely great. And, but they just want to talk with somebody else like, well, this is what's happening. And is this okay? Or how does this look? So I would imagine that was probably really nice for those 40 families to have that type of support during that time. That was just so unknown for so many people, and probably so different for all of those. Were those families across different districts and things like that?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So we decided to recruit just within our state, which is Tennessee.
Yeah.
We did that for a couple reasons. In research, you often think if you know you're going to have a pretty small sample and you recruit in a really large geographic area, it's almost like you're skimming the top. And what I mean by that is like you're grabbing the people who are the most connected, right? And that makes sense. They're going to see your recruitment post. They're going to want to involve. We didn't want to just skim the top and kind of get the families who were already well networked and connected.
Yeah.
We really wanted to go deep. So we just recruited within Tennessee. I was really, really proud of our efforts to recruit from diverse rural, suburban, and urban districts.
Yeah.
A really hard problem in research is just to have enough involvement from historically marginalized families. And so that's certainly a limitation of our study too. And I think about it like, the families who were probably able to participate in a study like this that required technology and that involved time were families who were able to do that. So in some ways, I felt, really excited about the sample that we had in terms of diversity. And then in other ways, I think we want to be really cautious to understand that like it was predominantly middle class types of families. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's just important for us to understand.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that because I have a lot of mostly people come on are PhDs. And so we've been talking about some of that in another podcast episode. We talk about marginalized groups. And honestly, for me, and I think a lot of other clinicians, if we're not doing that research and we're just like, number one, it's hard for clinicians to actually access research because they're so busy being a clinician. That number two, to actually analyze the research and how it's being done and just these things that you're bringing up. I appreciate you just bringing up as a talking point because I think for people like me who are a treating clinician, it's important because I think some people don't even think about those things. I think some people are starting to, and I think that's good. So what information did you gather from the study? What was shareable that you could share with us?
Yeah. So clearly I'm biased. I thought the study was very interesting.
Yes.
But ultimately, I think we can kind of talk about like three main themes that came up in the stories that these families shared. So the first was sort of around how they saw their goals and implicitly in that also their values for their child. So it probably is not a surprise, but I think it's really important to know that every single family emphasized that their child's communication progress was one of the things that they absolutely valued the most. And so this makes sense because these were all kids who really had communication difficulties. They had to either be non-speaking or have limited expressive vocabularies to be included in the study. I'm sure you're as passionate about communication access as I am, and it's no surprise like families are too, right? They want their kids to be able to communicate. When it came to literacy, it was so interesting. About half of the families talked a lot about how literacy was so important for them. And they had the same sort of rationale that I gave, all the listeners at the beginning, that literacy learning begins at birth and that for kids with complex communication needs, sometimes literacy is the very thing that like leads to communication gains. Like once their kids started understanding how to read and write, that helped them communicate more. So parents talked about that. About half of them did. Interestingly, about a quarter of the families talked really candidly that they felt strongly their child was not ready for literacy. And so I think this finding is really important to me because I imagine when their child was born, they didn't think that, right? Like kind of going back to this idea that like we all see literacy as something that begins at birth. And so it was so hard for me to like hear those perspectives and know that like, I think that's others talking into your lives to sort of say like, well, your child's not ready to learn to read. Or ready for, reading instruction. And then all the rest of the family, so a good quarter to a third of the families, like almost had never thought about literacy. Like it was really interesting to kind of ask them, like, they clearly want what's best for the child. All these families did. But it was like almost like providers hadn't had a chance to have conversations with them about literacy before. So that was really interesting too. So we had some of these findings around parents' goals. The second thing that we learned were about parents' experiences. And so I think it's not a surprise that they were really, really varied. We were really interested in trying to glean out, like, what about this is contextualized in the pandemic and what might be representative of a broader experience? And we can't say that confidently because we did this study during the pandemic. Everything is contextualized in the pandemic. But it was clear to me that some of what parents were saying around what made them feel confident or not confident was related to the challenges of the pandemic, but other things weren't because they talked about their stories kind of, from their kids' whole educational careers, not just that one school year. And so they were really clear that support from providers like speech language pathologists and teachers was what kind of made the difference in how confident they felt. And they talked about how frustrating and discouraging it was when communication and collaboration were really hard for their school. And then again, for some of these families, these things worsened with the pandemic, and they talked about that. But really interestingly, for some of these families, it got better because it was like now these teachers and service providers kind of had to talk to them because their kids were like located physically in their home during the school day. And so they talked about how it like helped for the parent to kind of see the other side about what was happening at school and for those school providers to kind of see the other side and understand what things were really like for families. So that was really, really interesting. And then kind of the last thing that we learned was how families viewed their satisfaction with those supports and then also their child's progress.
Hmm.
And most families expressed a lot of concerns about literacy, that they saw that this wasn't really a focus of their child's school and they wanted it to be. With this, they also talked a lot about difficulties with AEC.
Mm.
So I'm really interested in issues around communication access and how we help kids acquire AEC devices and then how we help families like really integrate those in their homes. And I think those of us who work in the AEC field know like there's a lot of challenges with this process
Hmm.
that definitely came through. So only one parent shared a positive story about acquiring AEC, like what that process was
Wow.
like for them. For every other family, it was frustrating, it was long, it was discouraging. And then they like got this thing and they were like, I have no idea what to do with this. Uh,
Right.
this part isn't even reported in the study that we're talking about today, but it's part of the larger project. We've actually like we got to observe these families during shared book reading and during play
Hmm.
activities, and only one child and one parent, the same dyad, ever used the AC device in any of these interactions. And
Wow.
so it's really compelling to me to sort of see outright the
Yeah.
challenges that we know exist.
Wow, that's really powerful. I'm actually, when this airs in 2 days, I'm doing an intro to AAC. It's a ASHA approved talk and an ACE talk too for BCBAs. And I think I will mention that because that is, we talk about a device abandonment. Yeah, because we think like maybe this is going to be the end all be all, but that's really just the race has just begun when you get the
Yeah,
device because it's a marathon, not a sprint, right? And it's
yeah,
just it's great to have access to that, but it's a really ongoing dialogue. Really
yeah,
interesting. I love that. I think that's really insightful, though, for us as clinicians to know. And I think that it's like the device is great, but what's so important is the parent training. I used to always say, as a school based SLP, my most important job is not the therapy. That is not the most important job. The most important job is actually getting everybody that's on the team, which usually when we have students that present like this, it's quite a few people, to get everybody kind of collaborating and the lines of communication open, which I love that you noted that in this research. So I feel like I'm doing something right on the right track. So I think some of
yeah,
us are hearing this going,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
So
yeah.
for people that are treating clinicians, what do you think are some implications? It's really interesting, and I'm sure you guys really got to kind of bond with these 40 families,
Yeah.
and in such a vulnerable time. And it's probably nice to have that kind of touch point on somebody. I just know families and parents I've had on the podcast, they want to share about their child's educational history because it is varied and it is like you said it's varied. Everybody has their own story. And for these parents to be able to share that, I think is probably really powerful just in its own right.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think when you were asking about like why does this matter for practicing clinicians, one thing that comes to mind is just around like how we talk to parents. I feel like so many families are told that their child like can't or won't do something, and like we obviously want to be, transparent with families about assessment results and those sorts of things. But man, I grieve these families who would say things like, I don't think it's realistic to think my child will ever gain meaningful literacy skills.
Hmm.
To me, that says that like our definitions of literacy are too small.
Hmm.
They only include sort of like very traditional, conventional reading and writing, and they don't include all these, sort of recognition that reading and writing and speaking or expressing and listening, those are going to develop in interconnected ways. And
Hmm.
it's not one and then the other. So anyway, I think for clinicians to understand literacy really well as, these ways that reading and writing and speaking or expressing and listening come together to help support human connection. And then to share that with families and to advocate for kids to have access to, really high quality literacy instruction. That ultimately like literacy is for all kids. It's not just for some kids.
Hmm.
But then the other part to me is around family centeredness. And so I think we could look at this data, like take the observational notes that I made that aren't actually presented in this research study, but will be in later ones, that none of these families except one were using these devices during their typical routines.
Right.
I think it's easy for a clinician to say, oh, why isn't the family doing this? It's easy for the clinician to sort of like say, and I've heard clinicians say this, and I know the clinicians are well-meaning. The reason we're not getting anywhere is because the family's not on board or we don't have buy-in from the family. all these families were bought in. They wanted what was best for their kids.
Right.
But it's like they're dealing with all of these responsibilities, and no one has really actually showed them how to integrate the device into their home. They've showed them like how to program words, or I don't know, like how to do the technical things, but not like, well, what does it look like to use AAC when you read a book? Or what does it look like to use AAC when you play with your child or around the meal table? Recognizing that, like, I've got kiddos in my house and like it's complex and it's dynamic, right? So I think like I would love to see, I hope that our policies and practices support greater family centeredness. I know that's really hard for school-based SLPs. In terms of just how structures are set up. But then I think whenever you have a chance, use a family-centered approach, consider the family unit, and reflect on like your own beliefs and practices as a clinician, your beliefs around like, what is this family capable of? And do you see the family just as like needing you, or do you see the family as having all these strengths to offer to your relationship with them? And then in your practices, right, like how are you equipping and empowering that family? I think our efforts there go a really long way, right? In terms of like, you won't be in this child's life forever, but their family will.
Right. Oh, I love that so much. And I think that's such a great point you make about, maybe we show them how to program something, or somebody on the team is available that way. Obviously, we know time is hard as a school-based SLP. That's what's interesting about being a BCBA. And usually when kids are getting ABA, they get parent training. And that's something like you have to have. It's covered by insurance usually. And they get all this time. That's a whole other podcast show. But I mean, you do have all this embedded time, right? So I know that I just filmed a podcast where somebody who is a speech therapist is working in collaboration with BCBAs around AAC, but that's a whole other topic I talk about all the time. But there are barriers to, well, what does it look like? That makes me feel good though, because something I've tried to do on my platform of ABA Speech, because I have these social media platforms, is I have these people that are on my email list, and they're like a BCBA or a speech therapist, but they have their own autistic child who uses an AAC device. And so they have shared videos of what it looks like to read a book in the home environment, or how to make a snack in the home environment. But I love to show those videos because it's communication at home. It's AAC. And when I see somebody in public who has an AAC device, I am so excited. I'm just like, that person's speech therapist must be really proud just because of what you're saying. And, it's not something that is happening all the time. So I think for everybody listening, trying to think about your own environment and how can you embed some of those parental supports. And it can be hard as a school-based SLP because we are stretched really thin, but it depends on your environment, but I have always been somebody who thinks about like, well, who needs the training and how can I get it to them? Could I make a video? Could I put it on the kid's iPad about what we're doing, or, taping little snippets of therapy to show what it looks like. So, wow, this is just really good information. You've had so many good little one-liners. I love literacy is for all kids, not just some kids. Boom. That's a really good one, Elizabeth. I love that. Well, because it's so true. And I think the idea that why do we stop embedding it across a learner's day, like ever, right? Because literacy can be a lot of different things. Well, thank you so much for doing all this amazing research and coming on the show to talk about it. I really appreciate you coming on. It was great to chat.
Yeah, so good to meet you. And thanks for the invitation. This was fun.
Thanks for listening to Autism Outreach. If you enjoyed the show today, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode full of actionable strategies you can use in your therapy room. Write a review too. That would mean so much to me. I always love hearing from you. Have a specific topic that you want included on a future show? Reach out over on Instagram, ABA Speech by Rose, or visit me at www.abaspeech.org.